When Big Shaq moved into a luxury penthouse, he expected success, not a fight for his place. From day one, Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell made it clear they didn't want him there. They schemed, whispered, and tried to push him out, believing their wealth made them untouchable. But they underestimated him. As their world crumbles, Shaq doesn't just win, he changes the rules of the game. Now, the entire city is watching, and the elite are about to learn that real power isn't about exclusion, it's about who controls the future. Watch now to see how one man took on the elite, and won. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city skyline stretched wide outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Big Shaq's new penthouse. The view was exactly what he had envisioned. Power, success, proof that he had made it. After years of hard work, grinding in ways people like his new neighbors would never understand, he had arrived. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a statement. The penthouse was sleek, modern, and worth every dollar. Dark marble floors, a high-end chef's kitchen, custom lighting, everything about it screamed exclusivity. The kind of place not just anyone could afford. But Big Shaq wasn't just anyone. And yet, the moment he moved in, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. At first, he brushed it off. He wasn't new to the cold stares, the fake smiles, the quiet judgment that came when people realized a black man had more money than they did. It wasn't the first time people assumed he didn't belong. But something about this building was different. The first few days, Shaq noticed the little things. The way conversations in the lobby would pause when he walked by. The way the concierge, an older white man named Robert, always seemed a little too surprised every time Shaq stepped out of the penthouse elevator. It was subtle, but constant. And then came Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell. It happened on a crisp afternoon. Shaq had just wrapped up a meeting in his home office and decided to take a break, step outside for some fresh air. Dressed in a tailored black tracksuit and designer sneakers, he carried himself the way he always had, with confidence. As he stepped into the elevator, he didn't think much of the two women already inside. Wealth dripped off them. Expensive perfumes, tailored coats, subtle but unmistakable arrogance. Charlotte Harrington. Mid-50s, sharp blonde bob, high cheekbones permanently set in a look of disapproval. The type of woman who sipped rosé at noon and treated staff like furniture. Denise Caldwell. Slightly younger, dark auburn hair, eyes that constantly scanned for something to criticize. The type who smiled in your face but reported you to the HOA 5 minutes later. Shaq had seen their type before. They weren't just rich, they thought they were the gatekeepers of luxury. The elevator doors slid shut. Silence. Charlotte shifted, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. Then she turned fully, lips pressing into a thin line. "You must be lost." Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh, so that's how this was gonna go. He let the silence hang for a second, just enough to let her feel her own words. Then he smirked. "Nah, sweetheart. I live here." Denise scoffed. Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which unit?" she asked, her tone just a little too sharp. Shaq exhaled slowly, already tired of the game. "Top floor." The reaction was instant. Denise's mouth parted slightly, like he had just spoken in a foreign language. Charlotte blinked twice, her carefully Botoxed expression faltering for a brief second. The penthouse. The reality hit them at the same time. The black man in the elevator didn't just live here. He lived above them. Charlotte forced a laugh, but it came out stiff. "How nice." Shaq just nodded. "Yeah, it is." Ding. The doors slid open to the ground floor. Charlotte and Denise stepped out quickly, not bothering with a goodbye. But before they turned the corner, Shaq caught it. Denise whispering something to Charlotte, both of them shaking their heads. As the doors closed, Shaq let out a low chuckle, rubbing his jaw. Here we go. From that moment, everything changed. The already cold stares became icier. Conversations that used to pause when he entered now stopped altogether. He noticed it at the gym, where a few of the other male residents, men who had no problem chatting with him before, suddenly seemed too busy to make eye contact. At the valet station, where the attendants, once friendly, now acted a little too professional. Even at the front desk, where Robert, the concierge, always seemed hesitant when greeting him, like he was unsure if he should acknowledge him at all. And then, the accidental encounters started. Charlotte and Denise were everywhere. In the lobby, by the mailboxes, even on his floor, despite having no reason to be there. One evening, Shaq stepped out of his unit only to find them standing in the hallway, pretending to examine a framed art piece that had been there for years. They turned at the same time, eyes widening slightly. "Oh, fancy seeing you here?" Shaq just stared. "On my floor?" Charlotte smiled thinly. "We were just admiring the decor." Shaq nodded slowly, not believing a damn word. The worst part? They weren't even trying to be subtle. A few days later, Shaq stepped into the lobby and caught Robert watching him, not in a casual way, in a concerned way. As Shaq approached, Robert cleared his throat. "Mr. Shaq, may I have a word?" Shaq folded his arms. "Go ahead." Robert glanced around, lowering his voice. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but..." He hesitated. "There have been complaints." Shaq arched a brow. "Complaints?" Robert winced. "Some of the residents, they're asking questions about you. About how you got your unit." Shaq's jaw tensed. He already knew the answer. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just saying, sir. Some people here, they don't like change." Shaq let out a slow breath. There it was. He patted Robert's shoulder. Appreciate the warning. As he walked away, one thought burned in his mind. They weren't just uncomfortable. They were planning something. And whatever it was, Shaq was ready for it. The air inside the luxury high-rise was thick with wealth, entitlement, and silent judgments. It was the kind of place where everything looked perfect on the surface. Polished marble floors, fresh-cut white roses in the lobby, a concierge staff trained to smile just enough but never too much. But underneath the designer suits and six-figure handbags, there were rules. Not the ones written in the lease agreements. The real rules. The unspoken ones. The ones that said who belonged and who didn't. And Big Shaq? According to Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell, he was breaking every single one. It started with whispers and stares, but it didn't stay there. Charlotte and Denise weren't the type to sit back and sulk. They were the type to take action. One afternoon, Shaq stepped into the fitness center on the 22nd floor, ready to get in a quick workout. He had just adjusted the weights when he noticed it. Silence. Not the usual gym silence, where people were locked into their own workouts. This was different. Charlotte and Denise were standing near the juice bar, their eyes locked onto him, not even trying to hide their disgust. Shaq didn't react, not yet. He casually grabbed a towel, letting the moment stretch. If they had something to say, he wanted them to say it. Finally, Charlotte stepped forward, arms crossed. "We have standards here." Shaq let out a low breath through his nose. "Here we go." He turned to her, wiping his face with the towel before tossing it over his shoulder. "That so?" Denise joined in, her lips curving into a smirk. "I didn't think people like you lived in places like this." Shaq exhaled slowly. He had been waiting for one of them to say it out loud. "People like you." She said it with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in her life. Someone who never expected to be told no. Shaq smiled. Not a friendly one, a slow, measured one. The kind that made people like Denise uncomfortable. "Well, you thought wrong." Charlotte scoffed. "You know, most people who live here understand the expectations. This isn't just some flashy apartment building. It's a community. A very exclusive one." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Ain't that funny? I don't remember seeing a test at the front door." Charlotte's expression tightened. Denise laughed lightly, shaking her head. "I mean, let's be real. This place attracts a certain clientele. We were just surprised, that's all." Shaq nodded slowly. "Surprised." "Right. That's one way to put it." Charlotte's patience had clearly run out. She placed a hand on her hip, voice sharpening. "Look, we're not trying to start a problem. But people come here for a certain lifestyle. We all worked hard to be here. Shaq's jaw flexed. He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the space between them feel small. You think I didn't? For the first time, Charlotte didn't have a response. Denise, however, wasn't done. She glanced at his black designer hoodie, his high-end sneakers, the subtle but noticeable diamond chain resting against his chest. What exactly is it that you do? Shaq chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. There it was. The assumption that his wealth needed to be explained, justified, that he had to prove why he deserved to stand in the same building as them. He took his time answering, letting them sit in the silence. Finally, he spoke. Whatever it is, I'm damn good at it. Charlotte let out an exasperated sigh, exchanging a glance with Denise. They weren't used to this, to someone like Shaq not playing along. This was a game they were used to winning. But not this time. Later that evening, as Shaq walked through the lobby, he felt eyes on him again. This time it was Robert, the concierge. Shaq had seen the man watching him before, but this time was different. His expression wasn't cold. It was hesitant, like he was debating whether to say something. Shaq slowed his steps. You need something? Robert glanced around, then took a step closer, lowering his voice. Sir, I probably shouldn't be saying this. Shaq studied him carefully. Then why are you? Robert sighed, shifting uncomfortably. There have been conversations. Certain tenants have been asking about you, about your unit. Shaq's jaw tightened. Let me guess. Charlotte and Denise? Robert swallowed. They aren't the only ones. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That right? Robert hesitated again. Then, with a quiet voice, he said, You should keep a low profile, sir. Some tenants don't like change. Shaq let the words sink in. Low profile. That was what they wanted. For him to shrink. For him to disappear into the background. For him to act grateful just to be here. He looked Robert straight in the eye. That ain't happening. Robert exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly, like he expected that answer. Shaq gave him a final glance before stepping into the penthouse elevator. As the doors slid shut, his expression hardened. This wasn't about money. It was about power, about who was allowed to exist in their little world, and who wasn't. But what they didn't know? Shaq didn't just buy into this building. He was about to take over. The invitation arrived in an expensive, gold-embossed envelope, the kind designed to make people feel special. It was slipped under Shaq's penthouse door, perfectly timed, perfectly planned. An exclusive gathering of our finest residents, the card read. A night of elegance, connection, and celebration. At the bottom, written in delicate cursive, were two names, Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell. Shaq exhaled through his nose, staring at the invitation like it was a loaded weapon, because that's exactly what it was, a trap. Charlotte and Denise weren't inviting him to be neighborly. They wanted an audience. They wanted him surrounded, outnumbered, put in his place. Shaq smirked. They wanted to play games? Fine. Let's play. The party was held in the Sky Lounge, an ultra-exclusive event space on the 45th floor, just beneath Shaq's penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, casting golden reflections against sleek black marble. Everything about the space dripped wealth. Shaq stepped in, dressed to kill. A perfectly tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. Just a diamond-studded watch and quiet confidence. The kind of confidence that didn't need to be loud. As soon as he entered, the shift was instant. Conversations paused. Eyes flicked toward him. The room was filled with old money, trust fund babies, and power players who had never worked a day in their lives. And standing in the center, drinks in hand, were Charlotte and Denise. They spotted him immediately, flashing those plastic practiced smiles. Shaq, you made it! Charlotte cooed, stepping forward with her arms wide as if they were old friends. Shaq grinned, letting the moment stretch. Wouldn't miss it. Denise sipped her champagne. We were just telling everyone about you. It's not every day we get such fresh faces in the building. Shaq chuckled. Fresh faces. That's cute. Charlotte looped her arm through his and began steering him toward the crowd. Come, Come. You must meet everyone. And just like that, the game began. Shaq had been in rooms like this before. Rooms full of money and quiet judgment. He knew how to read the undertones, how to spot the people who were trying too hard to be polite, and the ones who weren't even pretending. Within minutes, the subtle digs started. So, what sport do you play? A man in his 50s asked, swirling a whiskey glass. I don't, Shaq replied smoothly. The man blinked. Oh, really? Not even basketball? Shaq smiled. Not even basketball. Another guest, a sleek woman in her 40s, raised a manicured hand. Oh, I think I read about you. You must have won some kind of reality competition, right? Shaq chuckled. Nope, just business. Her brows lifted. Really? Fascinating. From the corner of his eye, Shaq saw Charlotte and Denise exchanging amused glances. They weren't trying to make him feel welcome. They were trying to make him feel like an anomaly. Like his presence here was some fluke. And then, the whispers started. Soft at first, then louder. Did you hear? He probably rents? Lottery money, maybe? No way he actually bought that penthouse. Shaq let it slide, for now. He had patience. But then Denise took it too far. She leaned toward Charlotte, just loud enough for Shaq to hear. He probably sells drugs. Shaq set his drink down. The sound of glass against marble was soft, barely a noise. But it cut through the room like a gunshot. The conversation stopped. Every guest turned. Charlotte and Denise froze, caught. Shaq slowly straightened, adjusting his cuffs, his face unreadable. Then, in a tone so calm it almost sounded amused, he said, You want to say that again? Out loud? Denise's face turned pale. Charlotte let out a nervous laugh, stepping forward. Oh, Shaq, don't be so sensitive. Shaq tilted his head. Nah, I want to hear her say it. Since she was so comfortable whispering it. Denise's mouth opened and closed. Trapped. The tension in the room was thick. No one dared to move. This wasn't what Charlotte and Denise had planned. They thought they would control the narrative, turn him into a joke. Instead, he had flipped the script. Charlotte quickly recovered, flashing a tight-lipped smile. Oh, come now. Let's not make a scene. Shaq exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. A scene? This is y'all's party. Y'all wanted me here. Denise finally found her voice. We were just making conversation. Shaq locked eyes with her. That what you call it? She swallowed hard, gripping her champagne glass. Silence. No one came to their defense, not even their so-called friends. Shaq took a slow step forward, hands in his pockets, his voice dropping just slightly. See, I get it now. This was never about a party, never about neighbors meeting neighbors. His gaze flickered over the room. Y'all wanted a show. Charlotte straightened, flipping her blonde hair back. That's ridiculous. Shaq grinned, but there was no humor in it. Nah. What's ridiculous is y'all thinking I was dumb enough to fall for it. Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it. Denise shifted uncomfortably. Shaq let the moment sit, making sure everyone in the room felt it. Then, he reached for his drink, took a slow sip, and set it back down. Thanks for the invite. And with that, he turned and walked out. The elevator ride back to his penthouse was quiet, but Shaq could still feel the tension from the party clinging to him. He hadn't exploded, he hadn't yelled, but he didn't have to. Charlotte and Denise wanted to humiliate him. Instead, they humiliated themselves. Shaq stepped into his penthouse, shutting the door behind him. He walked to the window, looking out at the same city skyline he had worked his entire life to earn. They wanted him to feel like an outsider, but they were the ones who were scared. He smiled to himself, shaking his head. They had no idea what was coming next. The tension inside the Sky Lounge was thick enough to choke on. The golden glow of the chandeliers, the expensive wine swirling in crystal glasses, the carefully curated perfection of the elite crowd. All of it was a facade cracking at the edges. Charlotte Harrington stood in the center of it, her manicured nails curled around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. Her face, usually composed and collected, was tight with irritation. The plan had not gone as expected. This wasn't supposed to happen. Big Shaq was supposed to take the hint. He was supposed to feel small, to feel like an outsider. He was supposed to leave quietly. But instead, he had flipped the entire room against her. And Charlotte wasn't about to let that stand. Charlotte took a slow breath, then lifted her chin, her voice carrying across the room. This building has a certain class. She said it slowly, like she wanted every syllable to sink in. And you're bringing it down. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, but no one stopped her. Shaq let out a low breath through his nose. There it was. The gloves were off now. Denise, standing just behind Charlotte, scoffed loudly, shaking her head. You probably snuck in here. Let's be real. Shaq turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Say that again? Denise met his stare, her confidence bolstered by the silent approval of the room. I said, you probably snuck in here. We all know how this works. Shaq tilted his head, lips pressing together in something that almost resembled amusement. Almost. The room was dead silent. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at the floor, pretending they weren't a part of this. Others watched with thinly veiled interest, waiting to see what would happen next. None of them spoke up. None of them stopped it. Charlotte clapped her hands, shaking her head like she was dealing with an unruly child. I'm calling security. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her phone. This isn't your kind of place. She was smirking now, convinced she had the upper hand. Shaq let out a slow, deep chuckle. The kind of laugh that wasn't really a laugh. The kind that made people nervous. Call them. Charlotte's smirk faltered slightly. Shaq spread his arms, tilting his head. Go on, call them. Let's see how that works out for you. For the first time all night, Charlotte hesitated. When the doors to the lounge finally opened, 2 uniformed security guards stepped in. Charlotte immediately straightened, her confidence rushing back. She gestured toward Shaq dramatically. Right there, that man is trespassing. One of the guards, a tall, solidly built man named Grant, barely spared her a glance before turning to Shaq. Mr. Shaq. His tone was neutral, professional. But it was the way he said it that changed everything. Not sir, not excuse me. Mr. Shaq. Charlotte's smirk twitched. Denise's hand clenched tighter around her glass. Shaq exhaled, nodding slightly. Grant. Denise blinked. Wait, you know each other? Shaq finally turned to her, his smirk returning. Except this time it was real. Yeah, you could say that. The second security guard, a younger guy with sharp eyes, looked just as uncomfortable as some of the guests. He knew what was happening, and so did Grant. He sighed, rubbing his temple. Ms. Harrington, Mr. Shaq is not trespassing. Charlotte visibly stiffened. Excuse me? Grant turned fully toward her now, his expression unreadable. Mr. Shaq lives here. Charlotte let out a forced laugh. Oh, come on, I mean sure, he claims. Not claims, Grant cut her off. Penthouse owner, full resident rights, cleared by management. Charlotte blinked. Denise's jaw actually dropped. The silence in the room became deafening. They hadn't known. They had assumed, 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 and they had been wrong. Shaq watched it unfold, his smile never fading. He had waited for this moment, waited for reality to slap them in the face. Charlotte took a sharp breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she clenched them into a fist. Well, then I want him removed for being disruptive. Grant stared at her. You invited him. Denise stammered. He was making people uncomfortable. Grant didn't move. Shaq did. He took a single step forward, looking Charlotte dead in the eye. Uncomfortable? Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it. Because for the first time, she was the one who felt out of place. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. Now you know how it feels. Charlotte's face flushed red. The security guards didn't remove Shaq. They removed Charlotte and Denise. Not physically, not dramatically. Just the quiet, humiliating kind of removal that happened when your entire social standing imploded in real time. As the 2 women turned toward the exit, their heads held high in forced dignity, the whispers finally started against them. Did you see that? She looked so sure of herself. They didn't even know who he was. Denise pulled at Charlotte's sleeve as they reached the doorway, hissing under her breath. "This isn't over." Charlotte didn't reply. She knew better. She had already lost. Shaq stood in the center of the room, taking in the shift. Some people still wouldn't meet his gaze. Some were still trying to process what had just happened. But a few actually nodded. A few actually saw him now. Shaq took one last sip of his drink, then set it down. He didn't need to say anything else. The silence said it all. By the time Shaq returned to his penthouse, he already knew what was coming next. Charlotte and Denise weren't the type to let this go. They had money, they had connections, and they had bruised egos. And bruised egos were the most dangerous thing of all. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Shaq glanced out his penthouse window, watching the lights of the city. They had tried to force him out. Now it was his turn to show them what real power looked like. Charlotte Harrington had spent years mastering the art of control. With a carefully curated life of wealth, social power, and an unshakable belief in her own superiority, she had never lost a battle in her world of rich, ruthless elites. Denise Caldwell? She was her perfect second in command, always ready with a whisper, a smirk, a calculated move that would tip the scales in their favor. But tonight, the scales had shattered. For the first time in her life, Charlotte wasn't the one holding the power, and she could feel it slipping through her fingers like sand. Shaq stood there, calm, unbothered, watching the panic in their eyes spread like a slow-burning fire. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had let them destroy themselves. And now, it was time for the finishing blow. The moment Charlotte smirked, thinking she had won. The building's senior manager, Daniel Whitmore, walked into the lounge. And he did not look happy. The color in his face was nearly gone, his movements stiff as he stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Everyone knew Daniel. He wasn't just management, he was the gatekeeper. The man who ensured the building remained the pristine, exclusive haven it was meant to be. And right now, he looked like a man walking toward an execution. "Ms. Harrington, Ms. Caldwell." His voice was tight, forced. "I need you both to step outside." Charlotte's smirk dropped. Denise's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Denise snapped, stepping forward. "He's the problem, not us." Daniel's jaw twitched, but his expression remained professional. "Now." Charlotte folded her arms, forcing out a laugh. "Daniel, don't be ridiculous. You know exactly what's going on here. This man," she waved a manicured hand toward Shaq like he was an inconvenience, "is making a scene in an exclusive residence. That's unacceptable." Daniel glanced at Shaq, then back at Charlotte. He took a slow breath. "Ms. Harrington, this is Mr. Shaq's building now." Silence. Charlotte blinked. "What?" Denise let out a nervous chuckle. "That's funny, Daniel, but let's be serious." Shaq smiled. "Oh, he's serious." Charlotte's stomach dropped. Denise turned toward Shaq, eyes narrowing. "You're lying." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Why would I need to?" Charlotte turned sharply to Daniel. "Tell me this is some kind of mistake." Daniel cleared his throat. His voice, though calm, carried an edge of finality. "It's not a mistake. Mr. Shaq finalized the purchase last week." Charlotte staggered back like she'd been slapped. Denise's lips parted, but no words came out. The room had never been this silent before. The same people who had whispered, smirked, and taken quiet amusement in Shaq's humiliation were now watching their queen fall. Charlotte's breath came quicker, panic creeping in. She had spent years building influence in this building, bending the board to her will, ensuring only the right people lived here. And now she had no control at all. Denise was the first to recover, her voice sharp and desperate. "But you can't. This building has rules." Shaq finally stepped forward, his presence filling the space, his voice low, slow, deadly. "Yeah." He leaned in slightly. "And y'all just broke them." Charlotte's entire body tensed. "What do you mean?" Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head like he almost pitied them. See, y'all got too comfortable, too confident. Thought you could run me out with your little party tricks. He glanced at Daniel. Tell him, Danny. Daniel exhaled, shifting slightly. Building policy is clear. Any resident found guilty of harassment, discrimination, or creating a hostile living environment is subject to removal. Denise gasped. Oh, this is ridiculous. We didn't harass anyone. Daniel looked at her, unimpressed. There were witnesses, Ms. Caldwell, security footage, and, well, he gestured around. The entire lounge heard you. Charlotte's face turned ghostly pale. Denise stumbled back, shaking her head. No, 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 you can't do this to us. Shaq's gaze never wavered. Watch me. Charlotte's hands clenched at her sides. She had to find a way to stop this, to fix this. I have been a loyal resident in this building for 15 years, she spat, voice shaking. You can't just push me out. Shaq tilted his head. Loyal to who? Charlotte's nostrils flared. I will take this to the board. Daniel adjusted his tie. The board approved the sale, Ms. Harrington. The decision is final. Denise let out a strangled noise, pure disbelief in her eyes. We'll sue. We'll... Shaq held up a hand. Stop. Denise flinched. Charlotte pressed her lips together. Shaq's voice softened, not with kindness, but with something even worse. Certainty. Let me explain something to y'all. He took a slow step forward. Money doesn't make you untouchable. Y'all thought you were running the show. But this? He gestured around, taking in the shaken guests, the silence, the way their kingdom had crumbled in real time. This was never your show to run. Charlotte was shaking now. Not just from anger. From fear. Real fear. The fear of losing everything. Shaq took one last look at them. Then, with complete and utter disinterest, he turned away. Daniel, get him out of my building. Daniel gave a crisp nod. Charlotte let out a shaky breath, then did the only thing she could. She turned, and she walked away. Denise followed, her entire body stiff, her world shattered. And just like that, the reign of Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell was over. As the doors to the Sky Lounge slid shut behind them, Shaq took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders. He turned to the stunned guests, who still hadn't recovered from what they had just witnessed. Shaq gave a small, casual nod. Y'all enjoy the rest of the party. Then, without another word, he walked out. By the time he reached the penthouse, the city stretched out beneath him, just as it always had. But tonight, it felt different. Because he hadn't just won. He had taken back his power, and this time, no one was taking it from him again. The fallout was immediate. The moment Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell were escorted out of the Sky Lounge, the whispers turned into full-blown conversations. People who had once turned a blind eye to their antics were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves. The same guests who had laughed at their jokes, nodded along to their subtle racism, and enjoyed their power plays were now murmuring about what had just happened. Because for the first time, Charlotte and Denise weren't the ones controlling the narrative. And the story was about to go public. By the next morning, emails flooded the inbox of the building's board members. Some were from concerned residents pretending to be shocked by Charlotte and Denise's behavior, trying to save face. Others were from people who had been waiting for this moment for years. Tenants, past and present, came forward. Stories surfaced. This wasn't the first time Charlotte and Denise had tried to push someone out. A black couple who moved in 2 years ago mysteriously had complaints filed against them for noise disturbances, even though they were rarely home. A Latino businessman who had purchased a unit was repeatedly questioned about how he could afford it. A young Asian family that had lived on the 20th floor had been pressured into selling after constant anonymous complaints about their children. And it wasn't just hearsay. There were emails, security reports, witness statements. The building's board, a group of ultra-wealthy executives, investors, and old money socialites, could no longer ignore the issue. So, they called an emergency meeting. Charlotte and Denise weren't invited, but Shaq. He was sitting front and center. The boardroom was cold, polished wood, glass walls, an air of quiet power. It was the kind of place where big decisions were made without emotion, only numbers, reputations, and money. But today, Emotion was everywhere. The chairman, Richard Calloway, folded his hands on the table, staring across at Shaq with a measured expression. He was an older man, sharp, calculating, the kind who never made a decision unless it benefited him. But even he couldn't ignore the scandal unfolding. "Mr. Shaq," he started carefully, "we've reviewed the complaints, and it's clear that Ms. Harrington and Ms. Caldwell have a pattern of behavior that does not reflect the values of this building." Shaq leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "That's so?" Calloway cleared his throat. "Yes, and we need to handle this swiftly before it becomes a larger issue." Shaq smirked. "Larger issue?" He let the word sit for a second. "This has been an issue for years. Y'all just never cared enough to handle it." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Calloway sighed. "We've come to a decision. Ms. Harrington and Ms. Caldwell will be given two choices. One, they issue a public apology to you and the residents they've wronged." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And two?" Calloway met his gaze. "Eviction." The word dropped like a hammer. Shaq said nothing for a moment, letting it sink in, letting them feel the weight of their own decision. Then slowly, he smiled. "Good choice." Charlotte and Denise were furious. By the time they were informed of the board's decision, they were already scrambling for damage control. Charlotte refused to even consider the apology. "I will not be humiliated in front of this entire building." Denise, however, was slipping. She had always been Charlotte's right-hand woman, but now that things were crashing down, she was panicking. So, she did the one thing she had always refused to do. She asked Shaq for a meeting. The Penthouse lounge was empty when Denise arrived. She had expected to feel in control. She had spent years looking down on people like Shaq, believing she had power over them. But tonight, she was the one looking up. Shaq was already seated when she walked in, his expression calm, unreadable. He didn't stand, didn't offer a drink, just waited. Denise forced a smile, sitting across from him. "Shaq, we're both reasonable people." Shaq let out a low chuckle. "We are?" Denise swallowed. "Look, Charlotte is stubborn, but I know we can work something out. Let's be civil about this." Shaq's smile didn't fade. "Oh, now you want to be civil?" Denise flinched. "That's not fair." Shaq cut her off. "Fair? Like when y'all tried to humiliate me? Like when you whispered that I probably sell drugs?" Denise's face flushed red. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Y'all thought you had all the power, but now that it's gone, you want to negotiate?" Denise had nothing to say, because they both knew. She had already lost. The scandal spread fast. Within days, whispers turned into headlines. Wealthy socialites accused of racial discrimination in luxury high-rise. Exclusive building faces backlash after years of hidden complaints. Penthouse owner stands against discrimination and wins. It wasn't just a local story, it went national. And Charlotte and Denise, they became the face of everything wrong with the elite. Their names were dragged through social media, their reputations in ruins. By the end of the week, they had no choice. They packed their bags and left. No apology, no fight, just silence. Shaq didn't celebrate. Not publicly, at least. He had already won. But he wasn't done yet. Because there was one last move left to make. At the next board meeting, he made an announcement, a big one. "What is the current management? They're out. We're bringing in a new team, one that understands real inclusivity." Some board members resisted, but in the end, they had no choice, because Shaq wasn't just another resident anymore. He owned the entire penthouse floor. He had influence, power, control, and for the first time, the building finally reflected the people who truly deserved to be there. That night, Shaq stood by his penthouse window, looking out at the city. This was never about revenge. It was about setting things right. And now, the building was his. The rules had changed. And the people who thought they ran everything, they were gone. Shaq smiled to himself, taking a slow sip of whiskey. This was just the beginning. The luxury high-rise stood tall against the city skyline, its glass reflecting the world below like it had never been touched by scandal. But inside, everything had changed. Charlotte Harrington and Denise Caldwell were no longer the queens of the building. Their reign had ended the moment they had tried, and failed, to push Big Shaq out. Now, they had 30 days to pack up and leave, and they were desperate. Charlotte and Denise had spent years bending the system in their favor. They weren't about to leave quietly. Within hours of the board's decision, their lawyers were already drafting lawsuits. Claims of unlawful eviction, reputational damage, even attempts to flip the script and accuse Shaq of creating a hostile living environment. None of it stuck. The evidence against them? Overwhelming. The security footage, the emails, the witness statements. Even their own words had buried them. Denise tried a different approach. She contacted board members privately, offering deals, favors, even thinly veiled threats. No one took the bait, because no one wanted to be associated with them anymore. While Charlotte and Denise scrambled behind closed doors, the media continued its full-scale attack. Headlines painted them as symbols of everything wrong with elitist communities. Luxury building residents face backlash over discrimination scandal. How two socialites tried to erase a man who bought the entire floor. Justice served, wealthy women evicted after years of targeting Black and Latino tenants. The news cycle wouldn't let them breathe. Social media was even worse. Clips from the Sky Lounge confrontation went viral. The moment Shaq had leaned in and told Charlotte, "Now you know how it feels," had turned into memes, reaction videos, and think pieces. Charlotte stopped leaving her unit. Denise deleted all her social media. The people they once partied with, vacationed with, controlled, they were laughing at them now. Through it all, Shaq didn't say a word. No interviews, no social media posts. Nothing. Because he didn't need to gloat. Charlotte and Denise were already drowning, and he had better things to do. 1 week before Charlotte and Denise's final move-out date, an invitation arrived at every resident's door. An open house event, hosted by Big Shaq. It wasn't just any open house. It was a networking event for new prospective residents, not the old money elite crowd that Charlotte and Denise had protected. This list was different. Tech entrepreneurs, athletes, artists, business owners, investors, Black, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, immigrants, people who had been quietly kept out of buildings like this for years. The kind of people Charlotte and Denise had spent their lives trying to erase, and now they were taking their place. The Sky Lounge was packed. The event buzzed with energy, not the cold, stiff kind that Charlotte and Denise had once cultivated, but something real. Conversations flowed, deals were made, people belonged here. Shaq, dressed in an immaculate black suit, moved through the room, shaking hands, nodding at old and new faces alike. Then, as the night settled, he made his way to the penthouse balcony. He stepped outside, letting the city air wash over him. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, glittering like a million possibilities. This wasn't about revenge. Charlotte and Denise would fade into obscurity, their power gone, their influence erased. But Shaq? He had rewritten the rules. He had made sure that no one like them would ever control this place again. He had changed the game. And as he took one last sip of his drink, watching the city below, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Big Shaq didn't just fight back. He changed the game forever. The elite tried to shut him out, but now they're the ones locked out. This is more than just one man's victory. It's a revolution against the old rules. Want to see what happens when power shifts and the real players take control? Stay tuned, follow for more, and be part of the movement. Because this story, it's only the beginning.